So Scott, thank you very much for visiting us virtually. So Scott Williamson is a political scientist, and he's in the Department of Social Political Sciences at Bocconi. And today we'll hear about people's perceptions and attitudes towards migrants. And Scott, so we discussed you're in a interdisciplinary audience, and this seminar is generally very interdisciplinary. So last week we had an anthropologist speaking, the previous week an economist speaking, right? And so we tend to get participation from people in different disciplines, and and sometimes of course disciplinary cultures vary, and sometimes people might just unmute themselves and ask a question if there's something like clarifying they want to hear about. All right, thank you. Please take it away. Oh, and sorry, Teresa also wanted me to announce that we're now doing a survey on the seminars, and she'll put the link in the chat. So if the participants can just click and provide us your feedback, that'd be great. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much. Thank you for those of you who are here. Thank you to the program for the opportunity to share my work. The title of the project is Combining Perspective Getting with Information Delivery to Increase Public Support for Refugees. This is joint work with a team of scholars who I've worked with previously on related projects, Clara Dita and Lauren Prather at UCSD, Adeline Lowe at University of Wisconsin-Madison, and Melina Platas at New York University, Abu Dhabi. So I'm very lucky to be working with them, and we all look forward to any feedback you might have. And I'm completely happy to take questions throughout, so please feel free to interrupt me at any point if something's unclear, or if you want to ask a clarifying question. Let's see. Okay, so I want to start by just noting the extent to which for the past several decades, or really since we have public opinion data, the American public has generally been opposed to welcoming refugees or specific policies designed to bring in specific refugees from specific conflicts, even those in which the United States has been very much involved. So we have evidence on this from World War II with Jewish refugees from Nazi Germany, but then also from Hungary in 1958, following the Vietnam War in the late 1970s, with Cuba in 1980, and then less so, but in 1990s with ethnic Albanians. But the general pattern here is one in which opposition to refugees has historically been relatively high. And we've seen this very much continue into more recent conflicts, most notably with Syria. So from polling by Gallup in 2015, at the height of the Syrian refugee crisis, 37% of respondents approved of welcoming in more Syrian refugees, but a fairly large majority disapproved. So this is a consistent pattern that we see over and over. This did change to some extent following the election of President Trump, when actually Americans over those 4 years became more willing to endorse immigration and the admittance of refugees specifically. But what we did see, which wasn't really as pronounced in recent years, was a growing partisan gap between Republicans and Democrats. So over this period, Democrats became more supportive and Republicans tended to become more opposed to admitting refugees. And these attitudes are very much reflected in the politics and policies surrounding this issue. So specifically with Republicans becoming more opposed, we saw around this time, as I'm sure you're aware, that Republican governors were resisting efforts to settle Syrians in their states. And of course, infamously, Donald Trump's Muslim ban was proposed in 2015 during the presidential campaign, then following the San Bernardino attacks, but also linked to these arguments about whether or not to admit refugees from Syria. So we do see that this public opinion seems to drive, to some extent, policy on this issue. And what's also quite common is to see that when politicians are justifying these sorts of policies, there's a lot of misinformation that gets trafficked in attempting to persuade Americans to be more restrictive in terms of immigration or refugees. So again, Trump's executive order or Muslim ban was implemented in some fashion. And the way this was justified was to talk about how in part how refugees or those coming to the US often don't get vetted very much at all. And so who knows who's coming in, who knows what kinds of threats they might pose. And of course, this is completely false in terms of how the US goes about vetting refugees especially, but this was a cornerstone of the policy. And even recently, we saw this with the 2021 refugee wave of Afghans coming to the United States following the fall of Kabul, when former President Trump at the time claimed that there is no vetting of refugees coming to America from Afghanistan. And again, this was very much false. In this specific case, it doesn't seem to have been very successful because this was a period in which Americans were more willing to support admitting Afghans. So with all this prevalence of misinformation, often used to justify and promote anti-refugee sentiment, one common strategy that seems common sense for advocates and activists is to publish information trying to correct these misconceptions in a very factual way. So this is an example of one such article from Human Rights First in 2016, where they say top 3 myths about the US refugee resettlement system dispelled, and then they go through those in quite a lot of detail. And so in this project, the primary motivating question is whether and in what context the provision of this sort of correcting information can actually change recipients' misconceptions. And so the first order question here is, when you provide this sort of factual information, do you actually see individuals update and correct their false views? But then second, and perhaps more importantly, we're interested in whether this correction of information has broader spillover benefits to reducing prejudice and negative attitudes towards outgroups, in this case, refugees specifically. So you might think that when you correct this misconception about vetting and the extent to which refugees are looked at very closely by the US government, that people might become less worried about security concerns, and that this would then spill over into their hostility towards refugees, perhaps their preferences even on refugee policies, and maybe even their willingness to take action on behalf of refugees coming to the United States. And then finally, providing information in this way is only one strategy that advocates have used and that scholars have studied in terms of trying to reduce prejudice towards outgroups. And one other common basket of strategies tries to leverage empathy, specifically to generate empathy for outgroups and reduce prejudice in that way. And so we're also interested in comparing the relative effectiveness of information provision relative to these empathy strategies. So talking a little more about why information might fail to, what the literature says about this information correction. In general, moving away from prejudice reduction for a minute, we do find that people tend to update falsely held beliefs when it is corrected. But when this starts to get political or tied into issues of controversy, that becomes less the case. And one area in which that is true is with prejudice reduction. And we have research on this question about immigrants and refugees specifically, finding mixed results in line with that broader pattern. So Bocconi et al., for instance, do show large positive effects of information about how immigrants would benefit Japan's aging workforce on Japanese citizens' attitudes and support towards more immigration. But that tends to be a bit of an outlier. Other studies, for instance, Adida et al., show that when you tell Americans how little, relatively speaking, their country did to welcome Syrian refugees, this doesn't actually convince them that the US should be doing more. Likewise, Sides and Citrin show that when you correct people's misperceptions about how many immigrants there are in the United States, which we might think would be linked to how threatening they perceive immigrants to be, that this doesn't actually have much spillover into how they view immigrants or immigration policy. So there are 3 reasons in thinking through these mixed findings for why this information provision may fail to shift attitudes, because of course, there are all sorts of different pieces of information that you can provide people with. And so the first may be that the facts are just already known to individuals. Maybe they won't even admit that, but they already know what you're trying to correct. And so it's just not that helpful. The second is that the facts are new. You are changing the way they think about something, but it's not actually relevant to how they form attitudes towards an outgroup, for instance, or the behaviors they might take towards that group as well. So if it is one of these two reasons that generally explains the null effects I just mentioned, then finding the kind of correct information in the right context would be an effective strategy to perhaps increase favorability towards refugees. But of course, there is a third possibility for which we have a lot of evidence in other contexts, which is that maybe the facts are new and they are relevant, but individuals' biases in terms of how they process information causes them to resist actually believing this new information or to incorporate it into how they're thinking about these groups. And if this is generally widespread, then we might not find this strategy to be particularly effective. There's another possible problem here that we wanted to flag, which is that correcting information in some cases may be counterproductive if it ends up priming threats and getting people to think about concerns they wouldn't otherwise have thought about. So if we think about informational interventions that are often used by advocates or politicians talking about refugees, they often cite the economic contributions that refugees make to the United States, for instance, or the fact that there is very low security risk from bringing refugees in. But in doing this, you may actually inadvertently raise the salience of potential economic and security concerns, or perhaps people will think that others are concerned about this, maybe I should be too. So I don't want to pick on anyone specifically here, but I think this infographic on the slide is a pretty good example of something that could have this sort of effect. So here they say refugees are economic contributors, clearly trying to address the potential concern someone might have that refugees come to the country and then subsist on government support, et cetera, don't actually help the economy. And so they say the top 3 industries that employ refugees are manufacturing, the health sector, and general services. But in looking at this, it's possible, we don't know, but it's possible that someone would be, well, okay, maybe refugees are then competing with Americans for jobs in these very important industries. And so you've actually primed an economic threat concern that ends up being counterproductive. So setting this information provision aside for a second, another set of strategies, as I mentioned, for trying to reduce prejudice or increase inclusive attitudes and behaviors is to leverage emotion and specifically empathy towards a member of the outgroup to then have that broaden into more inclusive attitudes more generally. So there's a large body of research showing that this tends to be quite effective, including with regards to attitudes towards refugees and immigrants specifically. So again, Adida et al. Show that if you encourage people to take the perspective of a refugee fleeing from Syria, that this might increase their willingness to write a letter to the White House advocating for lifting the refugee cap. Likewise, Brockman and Kala show that if you give people the perspective of an unauthorized immigrant, show them what it's like to be in that position, that this can reduce negative attitudes towards this group as well, in part by creating more empathy for their situation. And then work that I've done with these same co-authors, as well as some others, shows that priming people on their own families' histories with migration can also trigger empathy towards migrants today, and perhaps then shape the way they view immigrants and immigration policy. So we in this study wanted to build on this work with 2 questions, and I'll talk a little more about these in a minute, but the first was whether there might be beneficial interactions between providing information to correct a misconception and also generating empathy in the same sort of intervention, prejudice reduction intervention. So if we use these in tandem, does that actually create better results? And then the second is thinking about how these empathy generating interventions may work more or less effectively with certain types of people, and specifically whether individuals who just tend to be more empathetic in general respond more or less to these kinds of interventions. So on the first question, again, the idea here is, are there interactions between providing information and then trying to also do this perspective taking or perspective getting to generate empathy? And what we expected going into this project is that if you embed information correction in an empathy-inducing narrative, that this might help guard against the negative externalities of information that I just discussed, where you might inadvertently prime threats, but also then help with information updating. So get people to open up and accept that their beliefs were inaccurate and they update, and then perhaps actually incorporate that into how they're thinking about refugees more generally. And there are two reasons that in our mind this may have occurred. So the first is that emotions do affect how individuals integrate new information into their attitudes. This recent paper, for instance, shows that when people get angry, they're less likely to accept new information that corrects a misconception, and that this has effects on their political views. And the second is that the cognitive demand of taking someone else's perspective, or at least reflecting on it, can reduce reliance on stereotyping. And so in this case, when people get information that counters a stereotype or misconception they have, they might be more likely to then apply that information and update their views. And so these two mechanisms to us suggested that it might be possible to essentially turn information provision into a more consistent, effective prejudice reduction strategy by pairing it with a narrative that at the same time generates empathy for a member of the outgroup. On the second question, which is again whether these empathy generating interventions are more or less effective for individuals who have higher or lower baseline empathy, we went into this with somewhat ambiguous expectations for what might happen. So there's actually research showing that individuals with higher levels of empathy, who just tend to feel more empathetic towards others on a day-to-day basis, might actually have more empathy specifically for in-group members, because those are the people they relate most closely to. And so when they're feeling empathetic, that's mostly directed towards someone they can relate to most closely. And this might actually have negative consequences for intergroup relations if that empathy for their in-group then essentially causes negative views of the outgroup that they might perceive to be threatening their in-group members. And in this case, it may be that when you try to generate empathy through these other interventions, there's somewhat of a boomerang where that empathy instead gets directed towards the in-group, and then these interventions are actually less effective for those with higher levels of baseline empathy. On the other hand, if you are someone who is just generally more empathetic, that's probably going to make you better at thinking about what it would be like to be in someone else's shoes. And the ability to do that might then create more openness to updating your views of outgroup members. And in that case, we might expect that these sorts of interventions are actually more effective among individuals with a higher baseline level of empathy. So just to step back and summarize then what we're trying to do in this study. We're first interested in seeing if we can identify misconceptions that are actually relevant to how Americans develop their attitudes towards refugees. So find that information that people don't really know, and that also should have an impact on their views of the refugee population in the US. And then to see if in correcting that misconception, we can first actually get them to update their false view. And then second, try more generally to have that spill over into prejudice reduction and an improvement of attitudes towards refugees. And then the third is whether we can make that even more effective, again, by essentially shielding the information in an empathy intervention. So looking for that interaction between this information provision and using perspective getting. And then finally, looking at that heterogeneous treatment effect. So does this empathy treatment also work more or less well based on how much empathy someone has in general? So any questions at this point before I get into the design? Okay, so yeah, feel free to interrupt if anything comes up. So we try to answer these questions through two surveys that were done 2 years apart. The first in the fall of 2019 with an N of approximately 3,500. And the second in the fall of 2021, so just recently, with an N of approximately 9,000. These were not panel surveys, so these are not the same individuals, but they are samples recruited through Lucid, which provides scholars with an easy tool to get surveys done online. We fielded this through Qualtrics Online. And they're representative of the American population on key demographic characteristics, age, gender, income, ethnicity, education, region, and partisanship. So these are not the highest quality nationally representative samples, but they are representative on certain characteristics that hopefully let us draw some conclusions to generalize to the American population broadly. The first study was intended to measure baseline knowledge and attitudes of respondents about refugees as well as immigrants in the United States. And as I alluded to, the goal here was to identify important misconceptions about refugees. So we used this first survey to simply see if there are certain areas in which people are particularly likely to be misinformed about what the refugee population looks like in the United States. And then the second study included our information correction experiment along with that empathy intervention, trying to build from the first study to see if correcting the misinformation from study one actually has beneficial effects on views of refugees. So I'll somewhat briefly go over the results from the first study. This is a table showing some of the questions we asked in terms of trying to get people to at least guess or say what they thought the refugee population in the US looks like. So in terms of how many refugees were admitted that year, the median response was 20,000, and that's actually remarkably close to the actual number, which was around 22,000 in 2019. In terms of the percent of refugees coming into the United States who are women and children, it's a slight underestimate of about 10 percentage points, but a majority of respondents, on average, respondents thought that about 60% of women and refugees were women and children, compared to the actual percentage of 70 between 2015 and 2017. There actually was not really an overestimation of the percent that was Muslim. So looking at the years 2002 to 2016, on average, about 32% of refugees admitted were Muslim, and the average guess for our respondents was 28%. This did drop under Trump to 16, but I think in general, this is pretty close to what it was for a long period. And then there is an underestimate on how many Christians are admitted, especially for those years from 2002 to 2016. In terms of English fluency, we asked respondents to basically add up to 100 in terms of what percent of refugees spoke English fluently when they arrived, spoke some English, or spoke no English. And here respondents were remarkably close, at least on average. So a slight overestimate actually of how many speak English fluently on arrival, and a slight underestimate of how many speak no English. In terms of whether refugees pay taxes, the modal answer was not sure, but more said yes than no, which is the correct response. And so it's really when we get to these security issues that we start to see really large divergences from what the actual refugee population looks like. So we asked people the percent of terrorist attacks since 1980, for instance, that were conducted by refugees. The actual answer is 0. And the average response here was 29%. So this is a big miss. We also asked respondents how many months of vetting the typical refugee goes through. The modal response was 6 to 12 months. The actual answer is 18 to 24 months. And this is also a pretty substantial difference. In terms of the likelihood that refugees would commit crime, it's actually most respondents did acknowledge that it was an equal likelihood. And there is a bit of a miss too on origin countries. So most said Mexico and Syria would provide the most refugees in the year of the survey, when in fact it was the DRC, Burma, and Ukraine. So there are clearly misconceptions here. Some of this information is quite specific, and you might not expect everyone to know it, but even in those cases, people are getting pretty close. But what we do seem to see is a big miss in terms of how much refugees are tied up into security threats. And so just to provide a little more detail on that, this is the distribution of responses on the months of vetting that refugees go through. So again, the true answer is here at 18 to 24 months. Most of the distribution is quite a bit lower than that, especially with the mode at 6 to 12. And then again, there's a pretty big miss in terms of the percent of terrorist activity from 1980 to the present conducted by refugees. So there are many people saying zero, but quite a few are way overestimating that percent. And this is correlational, so we can only take so much from it. But there is some evidence that those who miss on the security threat of refugees, those who have the highest misconceptions here, are much less likely to have favorable attitudes towards refugees, as you might expect. So in terms of the feeling thermometer, they're much less likely to rate refugees warmly. They're more likely to also say that refugees might threaten national identity, increase the risk of terrorism, and are a burden on the US. We also in this survey had a question where respondents could donate money to the Refugee Council USA, or another pro-refugee group, or an organization that's been active in promoting stricter limits on refugees. And again, you see that individuals who are more likely to hold this misconception are much less likely to donate to the pro-refugee groups. And then finally, like also with policy preferences, those who believe that refugees don't go through as much vetting or commit more terrorist attacks are more supportive of the Muslim ban, want more screening, want fewer refugees. So this is not conclusive. This may be reverse causation, but it does suggest that perhaps these security misconceptions are related to how people are developing their attitudes towards refugees in the United States. I see a hand.
Yeah, I was wondering about some of the information that you compared the attitudes to, the factual information. Like, for example, what struck me, refugees engaging in crime, having equal likelihood of engaging in crime. And, I don't know that, I've always heard otherwise. And so there were a couple of other things also that you mentioned that seemed off the mark, but maybe I'm misinformed. So I was wondering where you got your information from.
Yeah, so we actually looked at a variety of sources to make sure we had this right. And frankly, several of these answers I would not have known exactly myself. And so I think our idea here is not to show that, this is a fairly technical specific policy issue, and to say that people should know exactly what percent of refugees are women and children, or if refugees are equally likely to commit crime or less so or more so. But in general, some of these misconceptions, if they're really large, might be contributing to how people are perceiving refugees as threats or not. And so the fact that people on average aren't so far off, we thought was positive for some of these. On terms of the crime one specifically, there have been recent papers published looking at this question with pretty rigorous research designs. And basically what they're showing is that as refugees come into an area, there's a precisely estimated null effect on crime rates increasing. I think this is pretty much the conclusion from other sources as well. I don't remember the exact citation, but if you're interested, I can provide it to you. Likewise with the women and children, Muslim, Christian, this we were taking directly from US government statistics online.
Thank you.
Yes, I have a question also. I mean, if this information is divided by political affiliation, And also a bit related to that is that, I mean, I think it has become harder for people conducting surveys to sort of get to the way people actually think. If you are ask, for example, their voting behavior, I mean, there have been quite some mismatches on what people say and what they actually do. So I wonder if some of the information that you are getting yourself might experience the same problem as well.
Yeah, that's absolutely a possibility. So to your first part of the question, there are definitely differences here, for instance, between Republicans and Democrats in estimating these differences on crime or terrorist activity, or how many refugees are admitted, or the women and children, et cetera. And part of that may be answering in a way that justifies more restrictive policies because you prefer those restrictive policies and then want to answer in a way that supports the policies. Whereas Democrats might do the opposite, which is that they want more refugees admitted. So even if they don't know the answer, they're going to just guess a low number on the terrorist activity question, for instance, because that aligns with the view they already hold. So we're taking an agnostic stance on whether this information is actually reflects, I guess you could say, their true beliefs. We did not incentivize them to definitely get it right. We were just curious in what they would tell us their conceptions were. And that's somewhat relevant to what we then do in the second study and how we set up whether information provision can actually reduce prejudice. Because one of the reasons that it may fail to have an effect is because even if the information is new and relevant, people just aren't processing it. And to preview a little bit, that's kind of what we find. So even though we basically update people on months of vetting, and it doesn't seem to have any spillover effects. And that might suggest that when people answer this question, they're just providing the answer that already aligns with their views. Maybe they have a sense of the truth and just don't want to say it, or maybe they just don't care. And so it's probably the case that some of these answers are driven by other considerations. Because again, I wouldn't expect most people to have thought deeply about the specifics of these issues. That's probably asking too much. And so where they draw their priors on are going to be informed by a bunch of different sources.
Thanks.
And if there aren't other questions there, but although I'm happy to take them, I'll move on to the second study. Again, the idea here being that we build from the first to try and see if correcting a misconception that stands out in the survey can have effects on attitudes towards refugees. So the structure of the survey, we first ask demographic questions and then refugee security priors again. So we basically ask some of the questions from the first survey that I just talked about. We then try to measure baseline empathy using a questionnaire from Davis. This is an old source about how to measure someone's general levels of empathy to get at those heterogeneous treatment effects I mentioned. And then we assign people to treatment groups or control, followed by measurement of the outcomes. So we have 3 treatment groups here and a control group. So the first treatment, and I'll talk about these in more detail, is that correction on vetting and security checks specifically. The second is providing a perspective getting narrative about a refugee. And the third is simply combining those 2 treatments together to see if there is a beneficial interaction here. The control is a pure control, so respondents don't get assigned to anything and they just proceed through the survey to the outcome questions. So this is what the information treatment looks like. Essentially, we chose to focus on the vetting misconception where people are underestimating how much refugees go through security checks. The idea being here that we could provide the most credible information to respondents by citing government sources directly. We thought this might have more weight, especially given that many of the organizations mentioned have fairly high levels of trust in the US. So we wanted to try and make this treatment as strong as possible and thought that this would be the way to do it. So first, respondents are told that they will read some information about the US and that we would then have them reflect on what they read. And the treatment itself on the next page says, according to US government and non-governmental agencies, refugees undergo more extensive and thorough screening than anyone else who travels into the United States. Biometric and medical data are collected from the refugee, who is screened by, then a whole host of security-oriented organizations. The average time for the vetting process is 18 to 24 months, but it can take even longer. To view an infographic of the process, click here. And that would open into a new tab. So not many people actually clicked on it. This is just a little more information about what we've already told them, and to give the source even more clearly if they were concerned about that. But this is the information that most respondents in this treatment group were getting. And then for the second treatment group, we went with a perspective getting narrative. So the idea here is that you take a narrative from an individual of an outgroup and you explain to people what it's like to be in their shoes, give a personal story about how hard it might be to be a refugee coming to the United States. We chose to go with a hypothetical story here, and we told respondents that because we didn't want them, we didn't want to essentially use deception. But what we did, and I'll talk about this a little more, is draw on real stories to create this story. The reason we wanted to do the hypothetical was to have as much control as possible over the information. So we have this story about Abdi, who we say was once one of 26 million refugees in the world. He flees war-torn Somalia at a young age for Kenya and then lives in a camp for 9 years. He says it feels like a big jail cell. They give you food, housing, and the rest will be from the hands of countries coming to help people like America. You just pray to Allah, when am I going to leave this place? We then talk about his experience in the United States, so how hard it was to settle in, and explain his background to people, whether that's Ramadan or Eid. Now he has a business, he runs his own accounting firm, he does community service, and he likes music like Led Zeppelin. So the first part of this is to try and give the experience of actually going through the refugee process. And the second, then trying to integrate and build a new life once you've actually arrived. The combined
Yeah, again, but by putting, some of the information that you put about this hypothetical individual, aren't you already sort of bringing up some of the biases that people might have as well? And then, so for example, I don't know, one of the things that they do in the labor market is that they put anonymous the name, because then if you associate certain name with certain characteristics of the people. So obviously here you want to get sort of the more of empathy of what is the process to go through. But aren't you also sort of, as I said, the people that are already have their own biases bring in that, or people who have doubts about that?
Yeah, that's definitely a possibility. So for instance, saying that he's Muslim, there's lots of research showing that people react more negatively to immigrants who are non-Christian in the US. That might prompt this. You mentioned the economic competition, that might also be the case. But I think what the prior research suggests is that when you really humanize people that often have face negative stereotypes, it seems like on average this is beneficial, and that is actually what we find. And on the hypothetical part, if anything, that might weaken the treatment if they're like, well, this isn't a real person, why should I care? So whereas the information treatment we tried to make as strong as possible, this one we actually were okay with it potentially being weaker. And that's partly because previous literature shows that this sort of approach is supposed to be more effective. And we were really trying to see, like, can we make this information provision helpful or not? And so I'll go into this a little more. The combined treatment essentially puts in the information paragraph after the part where Abdi is talking about how it was coming to the US, how long he had to wait. This felt like a natural point, and then proceeded again to what it was like trying to integrate. So again, these are hypothetical individuals, but we did base these on stories from real articles. There were two articles from the Courier Journal in Louisville, and then from NPR. The first was about Louisville immigrants share stories of terror, love, and courage on the road to America. The NPR one, Muslims in America, telling your own stories. And these articles are essentially doing exactly what our treatment is supposed to do, which is giving people this perspective, humanizing both Muslim Americans and immigrants. And we actually borrow real quotes from these articles and real parts of the stories. So the Led Zeppelin part, for instance, was one of these stories. The quotes about waiting to come to the US for all those years also were from one of these stories, going to Somalia at a young age, losing parents, etc. And so, we felt that that would be most likely to generate this empathy and humanize the individual. But also to avoid deception and just give credit to these articles, we then did have a debriefing statement at the end, just saying that, you read this story. This was based on real people. If you want to read more, you can click here. So after respondents were assigned to one of these three treatments, or if they're in the control group, after they were assigned to these three treatments, we then asked them to please write a short paragraph summarizing what you just read and how you feel about it. So we had two purposes to doing this. The first was we wanted people to actually think about what they had just read. We wanted to make it as likely as possible that they would really take that information into account or really reflect on Abdi's story and what that might mean for the experience of being a refugee. But the second reason also was because we wanted this module, we wanted the treatments to feel like they could have been their own modules in the survey, that there was a question to be answered about reading the paragraph, so that when respondents then went on to the outcomes, it wasn't as obvious that they had just read this story because we wanted them to answer these subsequent questions. So we're trying to avoid demand effects essentially by building in this question to the treatments. So after the treatments, or if they're in the control, they go to a new page and they have 4 outcome measures. So first, do they actually update their prior on the extensive nature of the vetting process? How warmly do they feel towards refugees? How many refugees do they want to admit to the US? And then would they be willing to write a letter to the president about their views on how many refugees should be admitted? So I'll go through each of these in turn and then show the results for each of them as well. So the first question was, again, approximately how many months of vetting does a refugee go through before being resettled in the United States? If you do not know, please give your best guess. So this is a question that we had asked on that very first survey. We then ask it in the beginning of the second survey, and then we ask it again in the end as part of the outcomes, and we want to see if people actually get the answer right on the second time. And so this is what the results look like with the distributions of responses on the number of months for the initial answers and the prior answers and the posterior answers after the treatments. These are the 3 treatment groups, and this is the control. So as you might expect, if there's no treatment, the respondents don't update at all. Why would they? The answers are pretty much identical. However, if they receive the information we give them, they do correct quite a lot. So now the distribution is centered around the correct answer, and most of that distribution is on the correct answer. For the perspective getting treatment only, where they read Abdi's story, they don't update at all, even though we talk a little bit about how long he had to wait to come. So what I will flag here is that we had expected that people might become more open to correcting their misconceptions if we embedded the information in that empathy narrative. And we don't really see that. Essentially, the effect here is the same if the info is on its own or in the narrative. There's no added benefit to trying to combine the two. The second outcome is trying to broaden out more, getting closer to prejudice or negative views of refugees personally as people. So we use a standard feeling thermometer saying on a scale from 0 to 100, where 0 equals completely unfavorable and 100 equals completely favorable. How do you feel about refugees who come to the United States? So here what we find is in the control group, an average response of 62, and providing that information about the vetting process doesn't really change this at all. It's also 62.6. So we might have thought that convincing people that refugees go through this extensive vetting would make them less worried about security threats, and therefore they might feel more warmly towards refugees because they don't see them as threatening anymore. But in fact, that doesn't happen at all. There's no broader spillover of the information into these views of refugees. However, these empathy narratives, the perspective getting treatments, do raise the average feeling thermometer score quite a lot. So by an average of 6 percentage points on the scale, from 62 to 68.5. And again, this is pretty consistent, whether it's perspective getting on its own, or if that story about Abdi is combined with the information. And again, we don't see any interaction here where combining the two makes them even more effective. The third outcome has to do with policy preferences. So we tell them every year the federal government decides how many refugees to allow to be resettled in the United States. And we then give them some context so they know what those numbers have looked like and how much they've bounced around. We say this year the number of refugees permitted to enter is 125,000. Next year, do you think the number should be higher, lower, or stay the same? And so again, information here, providing that correction on vetting doesn't make people more supportive of admitting more refugees. If anything, there's actually a slight backlash here, although that is not statistically significant. However, again, giving the narrative about Abdi does seem to make people more willing to say they would want to increase the number of refugees admitted. That's significant and substantively fairly meaningful. And again, combining the two doesn't really do much difference as we thought it might. It's slightly higher for the combination, but that difference is not significant. And then finally, we ask, would you be willing to write a letter to the current president's administration advocating for your position on how many refugees should be admitted into the United States? So they could say, yes, they would like to write a letter supporting an increase. Yes, they would like to write a letter opposing an increase, or no, they would not like to write a letter. And if they said yes in support or opposition, we asked them to actually write the letter to make this as behavioral as possible. And we said, and we will send it anonymously to the administration on their behalf after completion of the survey. So this is what the results look like here. And again, they're quite consistent, where correcting on vetting, if anything, has a slight backlash, although again, this is not significant. So you're not seeing that spillover. However, the perspective getting treatments on their own and in combination with the information do increase willingness to write a supportive letter for raising the refugee cap. So to summarize these main effects of the treatments, we do find that misconceptions on security threat can be corrected, whether that's information just on its own blandly provided, or whether that's embedded in a perspective getting exercise. However, that information on its own doesn't really seem to improve attitudes and behaviors relative towards the control. And recall here that we were trying to pick a piece of information where clearly people often had it wrong, and where also it seems theoretically and also from some of the regression analysis we did that this should be related to attitudes towards refugees. So we were trying to make this as strong as possible, but still it didn't really work beyond just correcting the misconception. That being said, of course, it may well be that another piece of information would have been more effective, and maybe we just chose wrong. On the other hand, we do find that perspective getting on its own or with information really does improve attitudes and behaviors, at least in the context of the survey, making respondents more inclusive in how they approach refugees as people and also policies. However, this doesn't actually cause them to update their beliefs about the vetting process, which is not necessarily surprising. So now I want to talk about the heterogeneous treatment effects I had mentioned in terms of whether that perspective getting treatment specifically is more or less likely to be effective based on dispositional empathy. And so again, it could be that those with more empathy actually respond less well to this treatment, or that those with more empathy respond better because they're more capable of processing the outgroup's perspective. And in fact, what we see for the three outcomes where the perspective getting mattered was that these effects were much stronger among individuals who had higher levels of baseline empathy. So in other words, people who are just generally better at empathizing with others were more likely to increase their inclusive views in response to the treatment than individuals who just for whatever reason are less empathetic. So this is what it looks like with the feeling thermometer. Among individuals who are below average in their baseline empathy, the perspective getting exercise with Abdi increased the average response on the thermometer by about 4 percentage points. However, among those with a higher level of baseline empathy, the average on the thermometer almost doubled. The treatment effect almost doubled to 8 percentage points. So this difference is significant and fairly large.
Sorry, Scott, are these results sort of, are they the same by gender or by other characteristics of this? Are they still so, or do you still find the same level of positive? Or for example, you would find that one is more than the other?
So I believe we've looked with partisanship and it doesn't seem to differ consistently. And likewise, I'm not sure about gender, but that would be a good one for us to look at. There definitely may be other heterogeneous effects here that we want to look at. But this pattern does hold with controls included. So it seems like as well as we can do, since we're not randomly assigning levels of empathy, that this pattern does persist. And I guess for me, partly it's quite strong because it's consistent across those three outcomes. So this is what it looks like for the policy outcome, where you actually see a slightly negative effect for those low in empathy for the combined treatment, although not significant, but you see quite large effects and positive effects for those high in empathy. And then again, also with letter writing, there's a slight boost for those low in baseline empathy, but there's a fairly large boost for those high in baseline empathy. So, when we're doing this analysis, it may be that there's some other omitted variable explaining the heterogeneous effects. We can't rule that out, but it seems like on average, those with a higher capacity to empathize with others in general are the ones who are most likely to be affected by treatments that try to prime empathy. And I do think logically that makes sense and isn't so surprising. So practically, that might suggest that these are the kinds of people to target with these exercises when you're designing messaging. So just to start wrapping up in terms of implications, there is some debate over whether trying to reduce prejudice generally or change attitudes on refugees and immigration is better served by doing this sort of information correction or by trying to leverage empathy about specific people and their stories. And our study is not the first to show, but builds on others, suggesting that these empathy generating treatments are more effective typically than trying to correct people's stereotypes or falsely held beliefs. But again, those effects seem to be stronger for those with high baseline empathy. And in fact, they may not exist at all for those who are lower on average in empathizing with others. At the same time, we do show that correcting misconceptions is possible. So when we told people that the US government does all this extensive vetting, there wasn't that much resistance to then agreeing with that information and updating their priors and saying, okay, yeah, I had it wrong. This is how much vetting they actually go through. So to the extent that we care about correcting misinformation, even if we're not showing in this study that that has spillover effects in other ways that we might care about, it does still seem that it is possible to get people to update on these sorts of issues, even when they're closely tied to pretty touchy political topics and debates. And to us, the main takeaway here is that interventions combining perspective getting or perspective taking, along with information correcting misconceptions, may be the most effective at addressing a range of outcomes. Because even though we didn't find an interaction as we were expecting, where these treatments became more effective by combining them together, the combined treatment was the one that corrected people's misconceptions and also had these effects on prejudice through the perspective getting narrative. So this may have practical implications for messaging that's emphasized by advocates. If you're going to provide information and update, try to update people's priors, you might want to work in these humanizing stories along with it. If your goal ultimately is to increase support for admitting refugees alongside correcting those misconceptions. Likewise, if you're going to humanize refugees as part of a prejudice reduction strategy, then you might also try and work in information, make the most of addressing as many outcomes as possible. In terms of where we go next, we would like to think more about heterogeneous effects and do some exploratory analysis in thinking about who these interventions work best for. We're only showing this short term in the survey, so it may be that these effects dissipate pretty quickly. In fact, they probably do. So we may try to look at persistence. And then potentially we'd be interested in trying to scale this up into an experiment with actual messaging in the field. So that's potentially another step also. So if there are comments or suggestions along those lines, I'd be happy to hear them. So yeah, I'll end there. Thank you very much. Comments are welcome. You can also email me directly here. And for the team of co-authors, we do have a nascent website that you're welcome to look at as well at this link. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I'm trying to remember exactly for your first experiment, exactly how you gave the information concerning the misconceptions. And again, I'm thinking about crime versus refugee vetting. What is the distribution of those misconceptions? And so I'm wondering why you took refugee vetting for your second experiment. And if there's something to learn from doing the experiment on a misconception that is not, that is not the average misconception, but where there is a lot of variety in what that misconception is. So getting at some of the heterogeneous effects probably.
Yeah, so for the first study, we simply asked people to try and describe refugees in terms of these characteristics, sort of one by one as questions throughout the survey. So we didn't randomize anything here. We weren't trying to incentivize getting the answer right. We just asked them to, say, please give us your best guess for what % of women and children are, what % of refugees are women and children. So we also told people explicitly, like, if you don't know, just try to give your best guess. So there we were just interested in seeing generally what the misconceptions might be. And for many of these answers, there is a lot of variation. So this, for instance, is the % of terrorist activity conducted by refugees. Someone is saying 100%. I like to believe that is an effort, a political statement, but maybe not. But clearly there's a lot of variation here that could be played around with. And I do think if we replicate a version of this study, it might make sense to use this misconception, for instance, instead of the vetting one, to see how this looks with a slightly different piece of information that in some ways may be even more direct in terms of what people are worried about. So I do think it would be valuable to play around with different types of corrections, because again, one weakness of this literature generally is that there are a million different ways that you can provide information correcting different misconceptions. And it's hard, we can think through theoretically why certain information might be better than others, but it may just be that this was the wrong piece to update people on. So that is definitely a consideration to keep in mind.
Thank you.
Would you be trying, or is it part of the exercise maybe going forward, and also to identify the people that are more sort of have more empathy, because obviously then you can sort of increase whatever policy you're trying to do, but I would not know how to do that. I don't know if you have thought about that.
Yeah, that's a great suggestion. We haven't, I guess, thought about that so directly. We have analyzed the correlates of higher or lower baseline empathy. I'm not remembering those precisely, so I don't want to say something that might end up being incorrect, but we have looked at that, and you can definitely say like so-and-so is more likely to have a high level of empathy. But thinking through perhaps how to identify people with more empathy in groups that aren't known for it might be fruitful, for instance. So that's something that seems worth thinking about.
And what about the characteristics of the individual? Like, I think when I'm trying to convince, oh yeah, I don't like to be called chairman of my department, and what would you think if your daughter was heading an economics department and she were called chairman? And it's because I can appeal to that characteristic of him being a father to a daughter. And so what can you do potentially in terms of learning how to correct these misconceptions and appealing to that?
So one, in our previous work looking at family history, we essentially try to do that because basically all Americans come from elsewhere, not all, but most. You can draw on that as a sort of shared identity or experience at some point in your family's past that people can relate to. And we show that this might increase empathy towards immigrants coming in today. So I definitely agree that being able to link your own experience to something they've gone through themselves, or at least tangentially are related to, perhaps because their daughter has faced gender discrimination and they've seen it, even if they're a man who can't go through it, then that will be perhaps more effective as an intervention on that type of person, because they're just more able to relate. So that may be the case even for people who don't have high levels of baseline empathy. If you can still find a way to link the treatment to something they have gone through personally, they may be more able to empathize then with the target, because they have some sense of what it is like to go through that. And so in our earlier study, we actually don't find heterogeneous effects based on baseline empathy. And I think that's in part because even those individuals have this shared family history of at some point migrating to the United States.
Yeah. They still say, but my family stood in line.
It doesn't work for everyone.
That's the response that they always say.
Yeah,
they're not standing in line today, but they did back then. My family did. Yeah,
absolutely.
Even though they didn't, right? Yeah, we know they didn't. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely got those responses as well. But on average, it seemed to have some positive effects.
I just have one comment. So is that we're running a survey about the seminars that we have offered for this academic year. So if people could just please completed and send it to us so then we can prepare for next year. And so thank you very much to Professor Scott Williamson for this wonderful presentation and just sort of to broaden the possibilities that we have in order to change the perspective of people about refugees. So thank you very much, everyone. And this is our last seminar of the academic year. Any questions, just let us know. Thank you.
Thank you.